Here we go, man.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for staying on for the final session. We actually opened the entire GenZero Climate Summit with a panel session on COP28 and global stocktake, and to some extent, we touched on Article 6. We've come full circle again on Carbon Markets 2.0 and Article 6. Can I just have a show of hands? How many people actually understand what corresponding adjustments are? Oh, great. So we've got about 30%, 40%. But you might have come across the term corresponding adjustments, but there are others like share of proceeds adaptation, OMGE, some say it's oh my God emissions, overall mitigation on global emissions. Net, maybe you can help us unpack what Article 6 is and how is it different from the market mechanisms we've seen in the Kyoto Protocol and the market mechanisms we see today.
Sure. Thanks, Anshari, and thanks again, GenZero, for a great conference and for this panel. Article 6 is one of those funny things where 30% of the room has read the text 18 times and knows it back and forward, and 30% of the room is not even sure what an article is in this context. So I'll try to pitch it more maybe towards the latter folks. So, and for those who were in the room yesterday, I think Dirk gave a great description of Article 6, and I think Benedict Cha did as well. It really is the opportunity for international cooperation in the Paris Agreement. If you read through the Paris Agreement, Article 6 is the one article that talks about how countries can cooperate together to ideally raise their ambition, to help each other meet their targets, but ideally to raise ambition over time. And if you are not steeped in it, there are kind of two parts to Article 6. There's Article 6.2, which is the second paragraph, that really sets out a framework for bilateral transactions or transfers between countries. And that's very flexible. There's a lot of opportunity, a lot of possibility there for countries essentially to determine what makes most sense, how they want to cooperate in terms of transferring mitigation outcomes. One country can do more, another country is willing to compensate for that. And so Article 6.2 provides a framework for that. And the main thing Article 6.2 says is you've got to do that with environmental integrity, and a primary safeguard for environmental integrity is going to be double entry bookkeeping, right? And so making sure there's no double counting of the tons if they're transferred. And that's where this idea of corresponding adjustments comes up. Many of us on the stage are friends with Kelly Kazire, who is the EU negotiator who claims credit for coming up with that phrase. Manuel Pedro, you were there, maybe you. Anyway, so the idea of a corresponding adjustment, it's just double entry bookkeeping if I'm a country that is generating extra mitigation outcomes and I want to transfer them to Pedro and he wants to apply them towards his nationally determined contribution, then I need to make a corresponding adjustment on my own accounts so that I don't count those transferred mitigation outcomes towards my nationally determined contribution. So it's just double entry bookkeeping. If Pedro's going to count it towards his target, I can't count it towards mine. Okay, that's 6.2. There's another part of Article 6, of Article 6, which is 6.4, that is still being worked on. We heard a little bit about that from Ben yesterday. That's a centralized mechanism. So if you're a country and you'd rather have a kind of UN stamp of approval on a credit that you want to apply or that you want to sell or you want to apply towards your target, then Article 6.4 is setting up that centralized mechanism. But that takes much more time. You have to approve methodologies. You've got to get a board put together. That took some time. You've got to approve methodologies. So that's still going on. We heard a little bit about that from Ben yesterday. The big difference, so Article 6.4 is most like the Kyoto Protocol Clean Development Mechanism, which kind of the carbon market cut its teeth on a couple decades ago. The key difference is that in the Kyoto Protocol, as folks know, not every country had to take on a commitment. So really, the CDM was envisioned as a way for developed countries that had mitigation commitments to essentially pay developing countries that didn't have mitigation commitments and pay them to do emissions reductions in their own countries. So you didn't have this accounting issue. You didn't have this sort of thing. Whereas in the Paris Agreement, everybody has a commitment. Everybody has a nationally determined contribution. And so you do have to make sure that you avoid that double counting. And so that corresponding adjustment I talked about also applies to those 6.4 pieces. Just quickly, because we're clearing out some acronyms, I have an old colleague who's now in the U.S. Treasury Department, U.S. Transportation Department, named Annie Petsonk. Some folks will know Annie. she always said, whenever you're on a panel and you start using acronyms, the audience should throw tomatoes at you. So I think we've got to be prepared for lots of tomatoes. But I will just say, if you hear SOP, that's the share of proceeds for adaptation. And the idea is that some percentage of the value of the transfer ought to go to adaptation. And if you hear OMGE, you stole my thunder. I love the idea that it's, oh, my OMG, oh my God, emissions. But it's the idea that some people would say you should reserve some share of the transfer, just can retire those credits. Overall mitigation of global emissions is the idea, to make sure that you're getting overall reductions. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Ned. I see some spring rolls out in the audience, so get ready for them to be thrown. David, maybe you could share how is Vera preparing for the new Article 6 world? And I know you've engaged with many stakeholders in the value chain, including countries. Do you think we are ready? Do you think there's going to be demand, and is there going to be supply for Article 6 compliant credits?
Yes, I do, and I think that we're starting to see indications of it today, right? I mean, the signing of the MOU, and we're starting to see much more activity geared towards, at least in the context of where we see it as a standard-setting body, is really seeing countries have to agree on the accounting mechanism under Article 6.2, and in many cases they'll choose existing standards like the VCS program or the gold standard. So I do think that we're starting to see more. I mean, obviously we're starting to see more, but I think that there's quite a bit of potential there. In terms of how we operationalize that, I think having a corresponding adjustment that needs to be tracked somewhere, and so where that happens in the carbon markets are the individual registries of each of the programs. So we're planning to have a mechanism where it allows you to essentially, set out, as a project developer would, indicate that you have the letter from the country government indicating that you have the commitment to issue a corresponding adjustment. Now, the key thing about corresponding adjustments is that they are going to be made in the future. The actual corresponding adjustment doesn't get done today or even next year, and it's going to happen when the accounting has to happen, which is out in the future. So what you're going to get, at least today, is a letter from the government saying, we will make a corresponding adjustment at some future date. That's an important distinction. But I think, as a registry, as a manager of a registry, we need to have a system that enables countries and developers to show that letter, and we can then essentially tag it on our registry so that people can look through that and say, oh, this project, it has the letter from the country that will provide that corresponding adjustment, to give clarity and transparency to the market. But that's something that we're currently developing and very excited about rolling out, because we will see, I think, some use, fairly big use of it.
That's great. Do you see any barriers faced by countries in terms of MRV systems and their ability to actually look at how the credits are going to be transferred from one system to another? Is there still a long way to go before countries are actually ready to implement Article 6 and develop the national registry systems?
So this is actually a very live question, right? Because ultimately you need the registries to talk to each other. And a registry, in some cases, what we're seeing is just the ongoing development of sophisticated registries that can talk to each other. It's not just a spreadsheet that you throw on a web page. It's got to be a proper registry. It allows people to have accounts, allows them to trade. And so we're starting to see a lot of really interesting work, and some work that AITA is doing with the World Bank is really interesting. It's the Climate Action Data Trust, which is essentially, it's not a registry, but it's a way that all the registries can link up to that and share information. And it will serve as a way to corroborate and make sure, for example, that no two different projects are issuing the same credit, right? That'll be really important to give confidence to the market. And then at some point, we will ideally be linking to individual country registries so that the credits that we issue can exist, can either, in the case of Colombia is a good example, right? So Colombia has a carbon tax. You can pay it, you can cover your tax liability issuing a VCU, a verified carbon unit, which is what we issue. But in order to make that happen, the unit has to go from our registry to their registry. And the way we do it is we cancel it on our registry, and then it gets created in the Colombian registry, and then it can be used for reporting purposes under the government system. So I think these systems need to talk. There will be a lot of evolution in this, and as governments start to design and implement and create the registries, you'll see a lot more of that.
Thanks. Pedro, tough question for you. Now you sit in the ICVCM and you're steering a lot of the work around the ICVCM. Can you share with us what's the intersection between Article 6 and the voluntary carbon market?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. First time in Singapore, and I'm immensely jet lagged. So if I'm rambling, sorry to everybody. Intersection between Article 6 and the voluntary carbon market. The way I look at it, first of all, I'm thinking, what is the instrument that we're doing? What Vera does is it certifies carbon credits. And from my perspective, and just speaking for myself, a carbon credit should be high integrity, whatever its use case, right? So we should be aiming to have all of the things that were out there in a previous presentation just now. Additionality, permanence, all of these criteria should apply equally, whether you are using it because you're a good guy and want to do good for the world, because you have a corporate responsibility, or because you are interested in complying with Paris Agreement goals. So in essence, I would say those are different use cases, but hopefully we could get to a situation where in particular, I'm looking at a project developer wouldn't have to think very long and hard about exactly what is different between developing a project for Article 6 as opposed to developing a project for a voluntary commitment. The only major difference, and that is kind of implicit in all of the discussion that we've had here, is really that accounting-wise, when you're under Article 6, you're under an international commitment or an international obligation coming from an international treaty. And therefore, that comes with potentially a set of obligations and a price premium that comes with it. So from a carbon credit developer or project developer, the question is, one, can I reach that high threshold for integrity that we hope will be achieved? And then, do I get a price premium that covers everything that an Article 6 adjusted or correspondingly adjusted credit should get, basically?
Thanks. Now we turn to someone who's actually looking very dapper today, John. As a project developer, someone on the ground, could you share Ghana's journey on Article 6? So Ghana has emerged as one of the frontier countries in terms of working out bilateral cooperation, first with Switzerland and hopefully soon with Singapore, right? How is Ghana able to move forward and be one of the forward-leading countries around Article 6?
Thank you very much for inviting me on the panel. And I would like to start by just stating that my colleague, Dr. Daniel Tutu, who's the government of Ghana's chief technical officer on Article 6 in the DNA office, is at the GST meetings in Europe at the moment and would have been here. So I have been a party with him and many others in the process of Article 6 policy development in Ghana. But quickly, Ghana started during the CDM period and we fell on our face. We achieved zero, not a single successful CDM project in Ghana. And that was embarrassing and challenging for the DNA office. We, as a country, we had the opportunity with Red Readiness around 2008. And Ghana grabbed that very aggressively and very rapidly became an early mover in Africa and beyond. But we couldn't convert the Red Readiness process into any viable pilots. But what we did do was we moved laterally and said, okay, we're struggling with pilots. We want to look at a jurisdictional approach. And we articulated and designed the first commodity RED Plus program in the world that was focused on Ghana's cocoa sector. And that was focused on approximately 5.9 million hectares of Ghana's high forest zone. And that was originated 2013. The first ERPA was signed on it with the FCPF in 2017, and the first payments to communities, to farmers, et cetera, flowed from 2022. And out of that, a number of really important things came along with it, particularly the issues of insetting. So the cocoa sector really started to look at insetting within this jurisdictional program, and significant private sector involvement. And then Article 6 came along, and Ghana grabbed it and really moved aggressively, and was, I think, with Vanuatu, the first country in the world to actually publish a cabinet-approved Article 6.2 policy, which was launched at Sharm el-Sheikh.
Yeah.
So that's been Ghana's story, from failure to becoming a global leader.
That's great. That's a great story indeed. Can I also ask you, as a project developer, where do you see the opportunities are in Ghana now that they've actually been forward-looking in terms of their Article 6 policy? Are you observing on the ground a lot more interest in Ghana to invest into projects in Ghana? Or are you saying because of the policy clarity, there are actually a lot more in terms of government support from other countries coming in?
Yeah, there's a high degree of engagement now from Ghana into other countries, and a lot of requests from colleagues in other countries, Kenya, Malawi, Ethiopia, examples of countries that are seeking to engage on Article 6 policy. And the best way to do that is south-south within the continent. And so when we can look at pathways to bring the expertise from Ghana into, say, a Malawi or Kenya or wherever, this is the most effective, both in terms of actual real learning and appropriateness, but also far less expensive and faster. So yeah, that's starting to happen and very exciting. There isn't the kind of support that I'd like to see to facilitate that, but yeah, there's demand.
Thanks. So circling back to what we talked earlier around the intersection between Article 6 and voluntary carbon market, here's a hot button issue for the panel, right? In Ghana also, they've got two different approaches for Article 6 and for the VCM projects, voluntary carbon market projects. Here's a question to the panel. Do you think corresponding adjustments should be applied to credits in the voluntary carbon market that are claimed by corporates towards their voluntary carbon targets? Anyone wants to take that? And it's not a yes or no answer. You have to explain why. And we'll take a poll from the audience after this.
Well, I'll be happy to jump in first. I'd be interested to hear the rest of the panel. I think the answer is no. That there's no that it shouldn't be a requirement for corresponding adjustments to be applied to the voluntary carbon market. Although it should be an option, and it can always it's there as an option for countries and for countries that want to authorize those units, which is the formal step that David was referring to, that sets up the corresponding adjustment, or for companies that want that corresponding adjustment. But why do I say no? A couple reasons. One is, remember, as I said at the outset, a corresponding adjustment is an accounting mechanism. It's designed to prevent double counting inside the Paris Agreement framework. Okay, the Paris Agreement plus ICAO, if we're being complete, is a complete accounting framework. So we're accounting. The negotiators, Pedro and others, did a great job making sure that there's a complete accounting framework, so that we don't lose any tons or we don't double count, we don't lose any tons. So that was really important for environmental integrity. The voluntary carbon market is separate, okay? And so there's no environmental integrity need to make a corresponding adjustment when a company is making a claim about its own operations and its own voluntary commitments. That's an entirely separate system from this complete accounting system we have over here in Paris. So we shouldn't confuse what's important in the accounting world of Paris with with issues around environmental integrity in the voluntary market. Now, again, as I said, if a country wants to do that because it feels that's the best route for it, absolutely, it has that ability. That's what the rule book allows it to do. If a company says, hey, we want to go over and above for some reason, we want to make a different claim, it should be free to buy a correspondingly adjusted credit, but there's no need for that requirement.
Pedro.
Well, first off, everything that Nat said, plus a couple of elements. There are some in the environmental NGO community and the academic community that speak of a potential perverse incentive that not having corresponding adjustments in the voluntary carbon market could facilitate, put it this way, this incentive, i.e. the fact that because you're bringing private carbon finance to a government, that somehow this would mess up that particular host country government's thinking about how they go about their NDC. Essentially, you would be rewarding lack of ambition in an NDC. The question is how big of a perverse incentive this actually is. And is this real? And I think sometimes in the voluntary carbon market discussions, we have a lot of scare stories and very actual fact. And in this particular case of this argument, first of all, we don't have any facts because we don't even have corresponding adjustments to begin with. So we're putting up this scary story that somehow countries will be freezing their ambition because of the potential for massive floods of finance coming from the voluntary carbon market. I don't think that's how governments actually act in any part of the world. That's the first thing. The other thing that I'm deeply conscious is that sometimes that argument goes even further in saying that actually the host countries should be the ones being, let's say, carrying the water for the corresponding adjustment piece. Some people argue that given that they've not managed to win the argument in the north, in the global north, that actually the global south and the governments of the global south should, be enforcing corresponding adjustments for any international transaction. I find that very disturbing, not being from the global south, absolutely, but very disturbing from the attitude that implies. I won't talk about carbon colonialism or nationalism, but it is a bit, I think, cheeky to ask of the global south governments to enforce something that the global north is not doing. So that would be my only additions to Nat's brilliant.
Can I really quickly follow up on that? Really, nobody ever talks in the corresponding adjustment case. It's always a discussion about if a company makes an investment in reducing emissions in a developing country, then there ought to be some corresponding adjustment. But nobody says when Amazon invests in electrifying its vehicle fleet in the United States, which reduces emissions in the United States, nobody says the United States needs to make a corresponding adjustment. So, I mean, but that's a precisely analogous case. So I think this gets to the point about there's this weird double standard in the conversation. Sorry.
David.
Yeah. So you were reminding me of all the debates that led to kind of pre-Glasgow. We're having very heated debates in the market about do we require corresponding adjustments for voluntary action? And back then, and still my answer is no, for exactly the reasons that Pedro and Nat laid out. But I did want to add two things to that. One is, from a practical perspective, if you think about it, the corresponding adjustment is meant to address the accounting, as Nat nicely laid out. But what happens in practical terms is that it forces the country to find an extra emission reduction in its economy. It's an opportunity cost. And I think it's quite right that we need to do it for an agreement, the Paris Agreement, where you need to have the accounting all add up. But I think it's unfair to force that on a country when you're doing it for voluntary purposes and where there are really, the accounting is very different. And so the company, in the case that's buying and retiring a carbon credit, isn't necessarily reporting to its country where it operates. So I think the accounting, it's just very different accounting systems. And in the end of the day, what we're trying to do is maintain the integrity of the accounting under Paris. So the other thing I wanted to add is that if you think about how this is going to play out, I think it gets resolved in the claims that companies can make. Yep. And I've been advocating that under the kind of revised claims that will be sorted out under the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, that we simply differentiate the claims. If you have a corresponding adjustment, you can make a certain claim. If you don't have a corresponding adjustment, you make a slightly different claim. And I think we just need to be transparent about it. That I find really frustrating, because I've found that we've gotten kind of locked in horns. We've got the environmental community like arguing with each other. And what we really need to do is just understand that there are different claims that you can make on the back of each one. And let's then let the market do its thing.
Fair. John?
Absolutely no. And I don't know a single African government that would agree to yes. Simple. And for most African governments I speak with, it's UNFCCC is a sovereign government to sovereign government treaty. It is not a treaty that involves corporates.
David,
yeah, let me just add one thing. You reminded me something, John. So I'm a member of the African Carbon Markets Initiative. And there is a great interest in a lot of countries in leveraging the voluntary carbon market to help drive kind of new activity in their economies. And it would be, if we required a corresponding adjustment, that would kind of upend that whole opportunity that we have at helping to drive that finance to helping countries, get on a sustainable path. So I think from a country perspective, I'm glad you brought that up, John. There's two perspectives. You got two options. You can, do a trade under Article 6 and have a corresponding adjustment. You can also do a trade without requiring a corresponding adjustment that helps drive reductions in your country. And importantly, what that does, it helps you meet your NDC, right? And that's very different, but very powerful.
Yep.
Great. After hearing the panel, which I can only summarize as a no, can I have a show of hands who still thinks we should apply corresponding adjustments to voluntary carbon market and claims made under the voluntary carbon market? It's great, Pedro, taking notes. I'm going to go into the questions right now, and there are some very great questions that have been asked by the audience. We want to also save some time at the end, because I want to get your closing lines before we close this summit around your theory of change for Article 6, not just Article 6, but Carbon Markets 2.0, right? So maybe I'll go straight to the first question. Actually, this is likely for you, David. How would Vera deal with the risk that a country doesn't follow through on the letter that it would make the corresponding adjustment in future? Would such tagging be removed or revoked after the fact? And maybe also more broadly to the panelists, how do we deal with the risk of a host country revocation of corresponding adjustments or authorization, right? And how do we deal with some of these policy U-turns which could come in future as we face with change of governments and all those things that we face? Yeah. David.
Yeah, so it's a great question, right? As I mentioned before, you get the letter saying you're going to get a corresponding adjustment. What if there's a change in government? They said, maybe not. So that's a real risk. It's a very legitimate question. And one of the reasons why we're taking our time to sort out how we do that. There are some potential insurance products that are being developed to address that particular risk, and some other mechanisms. But it's a risk, and I don't know the full answer to that, and it's partly of what we're trying to do to figure out, to make sure that we have integrity in terms of that process, because it's a very good point, and we need to have a proper answer to that.
Okay. Anyone else?
Well, I could just add I think it's now public knowledge that within the ICVCM, we have so two things. We have a working program with VCMI that David just spoke about, exactly on this issue of corresponding adjustments and the links to different claims and uses. But I just wanted to point out that we also have transparency requirements that from the ICVCM we would be putting on Vera eventually and other carbon certification schemes, that carbon crediting programs, where basically, I think the key point is We need that transparency in the market for everybody's sake to understand where credit has been revoked, put it this way, its potential host country authorization. We need to have that transparently reported. It does bring issues of uncertainty, insurability, and I think those are basically a broad category of political risks in the carbon market that we need to somehow figure out. I don't think it's the responsibility of the ICVCM for sure, but it's a wider issue.
If I can just make a point really quickly, I think the implication, now, of course, we were just 4 people, so we'll have to see where the broader consensus goes and the broader discussion goes on corresponding adjustments. But I think we're, maybe not a representative sample, but coming from different areas. So if we do end up with a market that has the consensus that says you don't need a corresponding adjustment for a voluntary claim, for a voluntary use, then it's important to recognize that this risk it might be a price risk, right? It may be that you get an extra price premium. There's a question about that. I don't know how to determine it, but it might be that the market evolves with a price premium for correspondingly adjusted credit because of the opportunity cost that David mentioned. So there might be a price risk that I'm a developer, I think I'm going to get a corresponding adjustment. I'm planning to sell it for X plus 10, and I ended up only selling it for X. But it's not an environmental integrity risk, right? And it's not so that's an important point. If once we accept that you don't need a corresponding adjustment for a voluntary claim, then it's not an all or nothing risk. It's a price risk, and obviously I leave it to the market experts to figure out how to manage that.
That's a great point. That this is not an environmental integrity plan. That's a very good point. There is another point I wanted to make, which this is a systemic thing that affects the entire market. So actually, we've been trying to advocate that we have a single solution that applies to all of the programs, because you could end up with yet another thing that's differentiated for a systemic risk, and we may come up with something, and Gold Standard might come up with something else, and a different program might come up with entirely something else. And I think that something like this that relates to accounting under the Paris Agreement merits thinking about having a single solution that everybody can apply.
So this issue of revocation is, for me, a very interesting one, because, I mean, this question, I assume, might be coming out of some of the carbon nationalization discussions and certain actions, particularly in some southern and eastern African countries over the last 6 months or so. And, for me, Article 6.2 policy, as it has occurred from Ghana, has been a game changer in terms of the clarity and the certainty around what government's roles and responsibilities are, what developers and implementers, what the stakeholders, the framework. There's a structure now. And right now in Africa, Ghana is the only country that has that. And I can tell you for certain that as a result of that, for the next 20 years in Ghana, any changes will be minor. Because this is going into legislation, and once passed in legislation, it's in draft form already, it's really hard to change legislation in most assemblies or legislatures in Africa. The things that can be changed are the schedules to the legislation, which are fees, but you can't go and just change the law. And so for me, this is really important, and thus the motion, the momentum on Article 6.2 across countries and pushing that forward, I think is really important for being able to deliver certainty to markets, to investors, but also for the in-country players, right? And even communities. I also believe there is an element in some of what has happened in certain African countries, and that's the only continent I know a little bit about, that is some degree of misunderstanding or miscommunication of some aspects of the way the Article 6 discussions are proceeding. And we hear that from politicians across the continent who have mandate and schedule, but aren't the technical experts. And so it's a challenge, and there needs to be understanding and negotiation. We've already had one African country which came out very strongly on a particular position, who is already rowing it back because they realize that was not correct. So I see this as Article 6 is actually the current solution. But it is clearly an interim. It is clearly an interim. It is not probably the final solution of where this is going to go. And what's interesting is that currently in Africa, it's being driven by bilateral processes. So Singapore, Ghana, Switzerland, Ghana, Senegal, and it's 5 or 6 countries globally. Why is it only 5 or 6 developed countries, or let me put it that way, developed countries? It's Switzerland, it's Sweden, it's Singapore, it's South Korea, it's Japan. To my knowledge, these are the 5 countries that are pushing forward bilateral agreements across the tropics. Why is it only those 5 countries? And as a result, my colleagues in the DNA office in Ghana have told me, John, there's going to be this, we're going to approve these countries. They've already named them to us, and no one else. So if you're an early mover, you're going to have a huge advantage in that Article 6 structure because it's bilateral, right? So the other countries who don't come to the party early are going to be cut out. So I watch this and I'm just going like, someone is not thinking in some countries. Why aren't they at the table? Why isn't the UK with Brexit and everything else at the table, like knocking on doors, wanting to do Article 6 agreements? They're not. But these are the kind of things that I look at, I see, and I'm going, wow, Singapore, smart move. Switzerland's got more bilaterals or in process than any other country in the world. Why? Is it because South Pole is from Switzerland? I don't know. Maybe South Pole gets the credit. But these are thoughts and issues, but ultimately for me, an Article 6 policy in any jurisdiction, any country will begin to provide the certainty to be able to move forward without fear of this kind of revoking of credits or changing the rules as occurred in the last month.
Thank you. Final thoughts. Theory of change for carbon markets 2.0. Anyone wants to volunteer? Pedro?
Yeah, I mean, let me say what my ideal world would be. My ideal world would see voluntary carbon markets, where possible, moving into a compliance space. Let's face it, that's when it becomes very real. And I think it was Dirk Forster at one of the panels this morning that kind of put it in perspective. The full amount of revenue of compliance markets right now is by now $950 billion a year. That's 2 billion in the voluntary carbon market right now. So it's scales of magnitude. And I think over time, and really it will take time, the ideal would be to move towards more and more compliance and more regulated spaces. In the meantime, what we would need is for the voluntary carbon market to really scale up with high integrity. That's why the VCMI, ICVCM, and the whole alphabet soup has been created. But we do hope that when it does scale up to a certain extent, it becomes a viable instrument even for linking up and thinking about cooperative solutions much beyond just the corporate commitment space.
Thank you. John?
I think we already have the compliance market emerging. Because take the G2G Ghana-Singapore agreement, should that be signed in the next few weeks, we have compliance on both sides of that bilateral agreement. I think that will be the first example globally. And that starts to provide a model. The limitation with that is it's bilateral. And it's not continental or global. But I think we already are seeing that occurring. And it's occurring very differently than the CDM story. And that might not be a bad thing.
Great.
Because the legacy, what the lessons learned from CDM was one size fits all is a disaster.
But we still have 6.4.
Absolutely. It's true, if we figure it out.
David?
It's too complicated. I'm
No,
gonna take
actually,
it-
David, maybe I stop you there. I want you to have the last word. Nat, maybe you want to give your last theory of truth.
Okay, so I'd say, look, I think we're potentially at an inflection point in the carbon market, thinking about both the voluntary carbon market and where we're headed with Article 6. And if we step back and think about all we've heard over the past couple days, I think there's an opportunity, if we take advantage of it, to go from a market that, at least in the voluntary market, is about $1 to $2 billion a year, which is zero, essentially. I mean, but it's zero relative to the need, to something that is mobilizing 10 or 20 or $50 billion a year. But so how are we going to do that? I think there are three things really quick. One is we have to provide greater confidence in the consistency of quality in the market. We've heard a lot about that. C2S is also part of the Integrity Council of the voluntary carbon market. Obviously, groups like Verra have been doing great work for years. I think there's an additional need for a group like ICBCM to say, here's a consistent quality threshold. So that's one really important mechanism, but we've also heard from ratings agencies, we've heard from CIX and so on. But providing more confidence in consistent quality, that's the first. The second I would say we haven't heard a lot about, but I'm a big fan of, is thinking about scale. Thinking about moving, not replacing project scale approaches, but thinking about bringing in jurisdictional scale approaches. Leaf Coalition, and what that represents on the forest side. And there's some new efforts, pioneering efforts on the power sector side to do jurisdictional. We're part of the ETA, we'll see whether that works. But moving to a jurisdictional scale where we can really start to move hundreds of millions of tons at once. And then the final piece is just where the demand is going to come from. John, I think, mentioned really well the bilateral market that's growing under Article 6. That's one. We've heard a lot about the linkage between Article 6 and compliance markets and what Singapore is doing. But Korea and Japan are exploring this too. I think that's another driver of demand. And I think when we think about the voluntary market, and this is where I'll end, I think when we think about the voluntary market and demand, we need to shift from what has been, I think, a focus about essentially thinking about the voluntary market as a way that companies can meet their commitments, which invites lots of concern around false positives, and everyone wants, my friends on the left, the NGOs want to keep it small because they're worried about greenwashing. We need to shift from that approach to thinking, how do we mobilize tens of billions of dollars in capital into climate solutions every year? And how do we take advantage of corporates who want to do that? So let's create a framework that doesn't give up on the integrity on the supply side, but makes it much easier for companies to make those investments in terms of the demand side. And I think if we can do that alongside what Ghana is pioneering and Singapore are pioneering on the Article 6 piece, and alongside links between Article 6 and compliance and the voluntary market, I think we can scale it up.
Final words, David.
Yeah, so I think that, I would agree with most everything. And Nat and I have maybe a different view on how you get the scale. And I think, the jurisdictional approach is fine. But I think there's also a very important role for project-based activities to continue to play a role. But I do think that there is some rethinking that we need to do to the toolbox to make sure that it can scale. When people talk about scale, yeah, it's great, it's exciting. But, at Verra, we're seeing the reality of having to review hundreds of projects coming in the door. That is complicated. It requires a ton of capacity. And I think that we're at a moment now where we're starting to see the digital aspects of the MRV part of the equation come to the game. And that's really exciting. I think that can help us really streamline that part. If we can think about how we drive greater finance to the market in a way that maintains integrity, I think, to me, that's the nut that we still need to crack. I think we can do it, but we need to be thinking about it, and I'll be taking a short vacation on that. Hopefully come back and think about that. But I think that's a really important piece to think about, because ultimately, You know, we need everything solution. We need the jurisdictional approaches. We need the project-based approaches. And we need to bring the finance to scale to make this happen.
It's great. And I will add on from what Fred has summarized, both tech and nature-based solutions. With that, we've come to the end of our panel. But before I close, I would also like to say to David, thank you so much for your contributions to this space over the years. GenZero, we've got many young professional investors, and we are, me included, I'm very young. We are inspired by pioneers like you in this space. So thank you so much, and we hope that you'll continue to contribute your wisdom and knowledge to this space. So on behalf,
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.